Jason pushed the hood of his jacket back as he stepped out of the school's main doors, glancing up at the darkening sky. The weather had been gloomy for days, and the weight of the heavy clouds mirrored his mood. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and began the long walk home. At 16, Jason had gotten used to navigating the streets of his neighborhood, a place where people kept to themselves but everyone knew each other. His sneakers crunched on the cracked pavement as he passed rows of small houses, some better kept than others. His home was just down the road, a modest 2-bedroom house he shared with his mother, Sharon. Life wasn't easy for them. Money was always tight, but they made it work. Jason balanced school with a part-time job at the local grocery store to help his mom with the bills. Sharon worked long shifts as a nurse at the hospital, and Jason did his best to lessen the burden. Today was no different. His mom was still at work, and after a long day of classes, he just wanted to relax before starting his shift. As he rounded the corner to his street, something caught his attention, a figure standing on the porch of one of the older homes. Jason didn't know the man personally, but he recognized him instantly. Mr. Clark, the reclusive old man who lived at the end of the block, watched from his porch as Jason passed by. The stories about Clark were common among the neighbors. Some said he was wealthy. Others claimed he was just a mean old man who never left his house except to buy groceries. Jason's friends told tales of how Clark would yell at kids for playing near his yard. Most people in the neighborhood avoided him, figuring it was best to leave the old man alone. Jason kept his head down, not wanting to catch Clark's eye. He didn't need any trouble. As he walked by, he couldn't help but notice the run-down state of Clark's house. The paint was peeling, and the once beautiful garden out front was now overgrown with weeds. It was a stark contrast to the stories of wealth that surrounded the man. Just as Jason crossed in front of the house, he heard a thud, followed by a groan. He stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. Turning back, he saw Mr. Clark sprawled out on the lawn, clutching his chest in obvious pain. For a moment, Jason froze, unsure of what to do. But then instinct took over, and he rushed to the old man's side. "Mr. Clark, are you okay?" Jason knelt beside him, his hand hovering over Clark's shoulder, unsure of how to help. Clark's eyes were wide with panic as he gasped for breath, unable to speak. Jason quickly fumbled for his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking as he gave the operator the address. "Hang on, sir. Help's on the way," Jason said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the fear building in his chest. He stayed with Clark, holding his hand until the ambulance arrived, his heart pounding as the paramedics loaded the old man into the back of the truck. As they drove away, Jason stood on the sidewalk, staring after them. His legs felt shaky, but there was a strange sense of relief knowing he had helped, even if it had been terrifying in the moment. He had no idea what would happen to Clark or if the old man would even survive, but he knew he had done the right thing. Jason finally turned and made his way home, his mind buzzing with the events of the evening. He never could have imagined that this one act of kindness would change the course of his life forever. The next morning, Jason woke up earlier than usual, his mind still replaying the events from the previous night. He wasn't sure what had happened to Mr. Clark after the ambulance took him away, and a part of him hoped the old man was okay. It felt strange to care so much about someone who had been nothing more than a distant figure in his neighborhood, but Jason couldn't shake the thought. As he sat at the small kitchen table, his mother, Sharon, rushed around getting ready for her shift. She looked tired, as usual, but still managed to give him a warm smile. "You're up early," she said, grabbing a piece of toast. "Yeah, I couldn't really sleep," Jason replied, poking at the cereal in his bowl. "Something happened last night." Sharon paused, her eyes narrowing with concern. "What happened?" "I was walking home, and I saw Mr. Clark, you know, the old guy at the end of the street. He collapsed. I called an ambulance." Sharon sat down across from him, her expression softening. "That was really good of you, Jason. You probably saved his life." Jason shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed by the praise. "I don't know. I just did what anyone would do." "Not everyone would have stopped," Sharon said, giving him a knowing look. "You have a good heart, Jason." Her words warmed him, but they didn't completely ease his mind. He wondered what would happen to Mr. Clark now. Did he have any family? The man always seemed so alone, and Jason couldn't remember ever seeing visitors at his house. It didn't feel right to just move on without knowing how the old man was doing. After his mom left for work, Jason decided to swing by the hospital before heading to school. Maybe someone there could tell him what happened. The hospital wasn't far, and Jason figured it wouldn't hurt to check in. When he arrived, he hesitated at the front desk, unsure of how to ask about Mr. Clark. The receptionist gave him a polite smile. "Can I help you?" Yeah, I wanted to check on a patient. His name is Mr. Clark. He lives in my neighborhood, and I called 911 for him last night." The receptionist nodded, her fingers clicking on the keyboard as she searched the records. "Looks like Mr. Clark is stable, but he's still in observation. Would you like to leave a message for him?" Jason wasn't sure what to say, so he simply nodded. "Yeah, just tell him Jason came by. I hope he's okay." As he left the hospital, Jason felt a strange mix of relief and curiosity. Clark was going to be all right, but what would happen next? Would the old man even remember him? Jason doubted it, but something told him that their paths weren't done crossing. That afternoon, Jason headed to his shift at the grocery store. It was a regular day, ringing up customers and bagging groceries, but his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Clark. Every time the doorbell chimed and someone new walked in, he half expected to see the old man hobbling through the aisles with his cart. By the end of his shift, Jason was ready to put the whole thing out of his mind. He had done his part, and there wasn't much else he could do. But as he walked home, the familiar sound of a car pulling up behind him made him glance over his shoulder. A sleek black car rolled to a stop beside him. Jason frowned, unsure of who it could be. The window rolled down, revealing a man in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. "Are you Jason?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Jason hesitated, suddenly wary. "Yeah, why?" The man stepped out of the car, holding a briefcase in one hand. "I'm Mr. Clark's lawyer. He'd like to speak with you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Why would Clark's lawyer want to talk to him? Had something gone wrong? Had he done something wrong? I don't understand," Jason stammered, taking a step back. "What does he want?" The lawyer smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "All will be explained soon enough. Mr. Clark has left you something in his will." Jason blinked, stunned into silence. A will? The old man had barely known him. How could he possibly have left him anything? "Please," the lawyer continued, gesturing to the car. "Let me take you to him." Jason stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But there was something about the way the lawyer spoke, calm, confident, that made Jason realize this wasn't a joke. Whatever was happening, it was serious. Nodding slowly, Jason stepped toward the car, his mind spinning with questions as the door closed behind him. Jason sat quietly in the back of the sleek car, his mind racing as the lawyer drove him through streets he didn't recognize. The silence in the car felt thick, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Why would Mr. Clark, a man who barely knew him, leave him anything in a will? What did the old man see in him during their brief encounter? The lawyer, a man named Mr. Adams, glanced at Jason in the rearview mirror. "I know this must be a lot to take in," he said, his voice low and measured. "Mr. Clark didn't have many people in his life. You helped him in a moment when no one else did." Jason didn't know how to respond. He had acted on instinct, never thinking it would lead to something like this. Mr. Clark had been a mysterious figure in the neighborhood, someone people avoided rather than engaged with. And now, here Jason was, on his way to meet a man who had been a stranger only days before. "Is he okay?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. Mr. Adams nodded. "He's stable, but his condition is serious. That's why he asked to see you as soon as possible." They pulled up to a large private hospital, the kind Jason had only seen in movies. It was clear this wasn't the regular public hospital where his mom worked. The difference in scale and luxury was overwhelming, and Jason felt out of place as they entered the building. The floors gleamed, and the soft hum of machinery filled the air. The receptionist directed them to the private suite where Mr. Clark was staying. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the door. He hadn't been sure what to expect when he first heard Mr. Clark wanted to see him, but now, Standing at the threshold, a wave of nervousness hit him. "Take your time," Mr. Adams said, giving Jason a small nod before stepping back to give him space. Jason took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bright and sterile, filled with the soft beeps of monitors. Mr. Clark lay in the bed, looking frail and much older than Jason remembered. His skin was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes, but when he looked up and saw Jason, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "You came," Clark rasped, his voice weak but clear. "Thank you." Jason shuffled awkwardly toward the bed. "Of course, sir. How are you feeling?" Clark let out a short, breathy laugh. "Not good, I'm afraid. My time's running out, but I didn't want to leave without seeing you again." Jason wasn't sure what to say. He felt out of his depth, standing in this room, talking to a man who had been nothing more than a distant figure in his life until now. "I don't understand," Jason said, his voice hesitant. "Why me?" Clark looked at him for a long moment, his tired eyes filled with something that looked like regret. "Because you're the only person who's ever shown me kindness without expecting anything in return." Jason blinked, confused. "But I just helped when you fell. It wasn't a big deal." "To you, maybe," Clark said softly, "but to me, it was everything." Jason shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know what to make of this. "I just did what anyone would do." Clark shook his head, his expression sad. "No, most people would have walked by. I've lived a long life, Jason, and I've seen how people can be. I've made my mistakes, shut myself off from the world, but you reminded me of something I lost a long time ago." Jason frowned, still not understanding. "What did I remind you of?" Clark's voice softened, his eyes distant as he spoke. "Hope, the belief that there are still good people in this world." The room fell silent for a moment as Jason tried to process everything. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. He was just a kid trying to get by, helping his mom and staying out of trouble. And now here he was, being told he had made some kind of profound impact on this man's life. Before Jason could respond, Mr. Adams stepped into the room. "Mr. Clark, it's time to discuss the will," he said gently. Jason's stomach tightened at the mention of the will. He didn't want to think about what that meant, about the fact that Mr. Clark was planning for his death. Clark motioned for Mr. Adams to come closer, his breathing growing more labored. "I don't have much time left, Jason," Clark said, his voice faint. "And I want you to know that I'm leaving you something important. You may not understand it now, but you will." Jason swallowed hard, his heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Adams stepped forward with a thick folder, placing it gently on the bedside table. "Mr. Clark has named you as the primary beneficiary in his will, Jason. It's all outlined in here." Jason's eyes widened. "What? Why? I don't—" "It's because I trust you," Clark interrupted, his eyes locking onto Jason's. "I've lived a long life, but I've been alone for most of it. You gave me something no one else did. I want you to have this, Jason. I believe you'll do the right thing with it." Jason stood there, speechless. The weight of the moment hit him like a tidal wave. He had no idea what Clark was leaving him, but he knew that whatever it was, it came with a heavy responsibility. He didn't feel ready. How could he be? He was just a kid from a struggling neighborhood, and now an old man he barely knew was trusting him with something huge. "I don't know what to say," Jason whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Clark replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just promise me you'll use it wisely." Jason nodded, though he still didn't fully understand. "I promise." Clark smiled faintly, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. Jason stood there, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whatever came next, he knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jason spent the next few days in a daze, unsure of how to process what had happened. He couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Clark's words, the responsibility the old man had trusted him with. It didn't feel real, and he wasn't sure it ever would. He'd gone from helping an old man who had collapsed to inheriting something he still didn't fully understand. Then came the news that Mr. Clark had passed away. The call from Mr. Adams was brief but serious. Mr. Clark's death had triggered the reading of the will, and Jason was expected to attend. Jason hadn't told anyone, not even his mother, what had happened. It felt too strange, too big. He could barely understand it himself, and part of him worried how people would react. When Mr. Clark's will became public, that worry became reality. The will reading took place in a small, stuffy conference room at a law firm downtown. Jason sat nervously at a long table, surrounded by people he didn't know, members of Mr. Clark's estranged family, all of whom looked impatient and irritated. Mr. Adams stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat before addressing the group. "Thank you all for being here. I'll get straight to the point. Mr. Clark has left the majority of his estate to Jason," he said, gesturing toward Jason. The room went silent. Every eye in the room turned toward Jason, and in that moment, he wished he could disappear. The shock on their faces quickly morphed into something far worse: anger. A woman at the far end of the table, who Jason guessed was one of Clark's relatives, scoffed loudly. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "Who even is this kid?" Jason's stomach churned as he tried to stay calm. I helped him when he collapsed. I didn't ask for anything," Jason said quietly, though his voice trembled with the weight of the accusation. "That's convenient," a man sitting next to the woman sneered. "What did you do? Manipulate an old man on his deathbed? You don't even know him!" Jason flinched at the harshness of their words, but before he could respond, Mr. Adams spoke up. "Mr. Clark made this decision of his own free will. Jason did not manipulate anyone. He simply showed Mr. Clark a kindness that deeply affected him." "Kindness?" Another voice cut in. "What about his family? We're his blood. This kid's a stranger." The room erupted into chaos, with Clark's relatives hurling accusations at Jason, their voices growing louder and more hostile by the second. Jason's heart raced. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't even know what to say. The anger in the room was suffocating, and all he wanted was to escape. Mr. Adams tried to regain control of the situation, but the damage was done. The hostility in the room was palpable, and Jason knew it wouldn't end here. As he stood to leave, one of the relatives muttered, "We'll contest this. Mark my words." Jason rushed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what contesting the will meant, but he knew it wasn't good. The backlash began almost immediately. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. Everyone was talking about how Jason, a kid from a struggling family, had inherited a fortune from Mr. Clark. People he barely knew suddenly had opinions on him, on what he'd done, and on what he didn't deserve. The whispers grew louder by the day. Jason couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of people's stares, their judgments hanging in the air. Every time he went to the store or passed by the local diner, he could feel people watching him, talking about him. It wasn't long before the media picked up the story. Local news channels ran headlines about the black teen who inherited a fortune, and reporters camped outside his house, asking for interviews. Jason tried to avoid them, ducking through back streets on his way home to escape their relentless questions. At school, things weren't much better. Some kids looked at him with awe, like he was some kind of celebrity, while others treated him like a pariah. They whispered behind his back, calling him a gold digger and worse. The pressure was overwhelming, and Jason didn't know how to deal with it. One afternoon, as he sat alone in the school cafeteria, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it and saw a headline that made his stomach drop. "Old man's will contested. Family claims teen manipulated dying benefactor." Jason's heart raced as he read the article. It was filled with accusations from Clark's family, painting Jason as a con artist who had taken advantage of an old man. The article quoted family members who claimed Clark had been vulnerable and confused, and that Jason had somehow tricked him into leaving the money to him. Jason felt sick. None of it was true, but the damage was already done. He could feel his phone buzzing more and more as people messaged him, some offering support, others echoing the hurtful accusations. That night, Jason sat on the couch with his mom, Sharon, who had finally found out about everything. She looked at him with a mixture of worry and pride. "I wish you'd told me sooner," she said softly. "You didn't have to go through all this alone." "I didn't know what to say," Jason muttered, staring at his hands. "I didn't ask for any of this, Mom. I just wanted to help him, that's all." Sharon placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know, Jason, and I'm proud of you for that. Mr. Clark saw something good in you, and I do too." Jason swallowed hard, fighting back the wave of emotion rising in his chest. He didn't feel good. He felt overwhelmed, trapped in a situation he never asked for. "What do I do now?" he whispered, his voice shaky. Sharon sighed, her eyes filled with concern. "We fight this. We show them who you really are." Jason nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure how they could ever fight something like this. He wasn't just up against Clark's family. He was up against the weight of the world's assumptions, its unfair judgments, and the battle was only just beginning. The weeks after the will contest felt like a blur. The legal battle that Clark's family had promised began almost immediately, and Jason found himself thrust into a world he never expected to navigate. Lawyers, courtrooms, and paperwork became a regular part of his life, something he could barely wrap his head around. His mother, Sharon, stayed by his side through it all, offering quiet strength and guidance. As the days turned into weeks, the trial loomed closer, and Jason's anxiety grew. He hated the spotlight, the attention that felt more like a burden than a gift. Everywhere he went, people stared. He could hear the whispers, some supportive, others dripping with skepticism and judgment. The court date arrived quicker than Jason had anticipated, and before he knew it, he was sitting in a small courtroom, flanked by his lawyer and his mother. Across the room sat Mr. Clark's family, their faces cold and accusatory. The tension was thick in the air as the proceedings began, and Jason couldn't help but feel like a child lost in the middle of something far too big for him. His lawyer, Mr. Hughes, a kind but firm man, gave Jason a reassuring nod as the judge entered the courtroom. The next few hours passed in a haze. Jason could barely focus as Clark's family threw accusations at him, claiming that he had manipulated an old, confused man into leaving him everything. They painted Jason as an opportunist, someone who had preyed on Clark's vulnerability. Jason wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that all he had done was help a man in need. But no matter how many times he tried to tell himself that, the weight of the accusations pressed down on him. How was he supposed to prove that his intentions had been pure? How was he supposed to prove that all he had done was act out of kindness? As the day dragged on, Jason began to lose hope. It felt like he was being crushed under the pressure of everything happening around him. His mother squeezed his hand, offering silent comfort, but Jason could feel the doubt creeping into his mind. Maybe Clark's family would win. Maybe this would all end with him losing something he never asked for in the first place. But then, Mr. Hughes stood up, holding a letter in his hand. Jason recognized it immediately. It was the letter from Mr. Clark, the one that had been read to him in the hospital room. Hughes stepped forward, addressing the judge and the court. "This letter," Hughes began, "was written by Mr. Clark himself, shortly before his passing. It is addressed to Jason, but I believe its contents will speak volumes to everyone in this room." The courtroom fell silent as Hughes opened the letter and began to read. "To Jason, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. There are things I need to say to you, things I couldn't say while I was alive. You showed me kindness when I had forgotten what that even felt like. In all my years, I had pushed people away, built walls around myself, thinking that I didn't need anyone. But you reminded me that humanity still exists. You reminded me that there is good in this world. I know you didn't help me because you wanted anything in return. That's what makes you different from most people I've known. You didn't ask for this inheritance, but I leave it to you because I believe you'll do something meaningful with it. I've watched you, Jason. I've seen how hard you work, how you care for your mother, how you move through life with quiet determination. You have a good heart, and that's something money can't buy. Use what I've given you wisely. It's not just money, Jason. It's an opportunity to change your life and the lives of those around you. I'm trusting you to make the right choices, not because you have to, but because I know you will. Thank you for reminding me of what it means to be human. Clark." As Hughes finished reading, the courtroom remained silent. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, waiting for the inevitable backlash from Clark's family. But something had shifted. The letter, Clark's words, had cut through the noise of the accusations and the anger. For the first time, it felt like people were seeing Jason for who he truly was. not the manipulative figure the media and Clark's family had painted him as, but a young man who had done something simple, yet profound. The judge looked over the letter, his expression thoughtful before addressing the courtroom. It's clear from this letter that Mr. Clark's intentions were well considered. This is not a case of manipulation or coercion. The evidence provided shows that Mr. Clark made his decision with full clarity of mind. Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him as the judge continued. The court rules in favor of the will. Jason is the rightful beneficiary of Mr. Clark's estate. A stunned silence fell over the room. Jason could hardly believe it. He had won. But even in victory, the weight of everything still pressed on him. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about doing right by a man who had seen something in him that Jason was only just beginning to understand. Later that day, Jason and his mother sat together on the front porch of their house. The legal battle was over, but the journey ahead was just beginning. Jason looked out at the neighborhood he'd grown up in, the place he called home. Clark had left him a fortune, but with it came a responsibility to make a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of the people around him. "I don't know what to do, Mom," Jason said quietly, his hands resting in his lap. Sharon smiled gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You'll figure it out, Jason. Just take it one step at a time. You've got a good head on your shoulders, and you've got a good heart. That's all you need." Jason nodded, though the enormity of what lay ahead still felt overwhelming. He knew one thing for sure, though. Whatever he did next, it would be in honor of Mr. Clark's memory. And it would be done with the same kindness and integrity that had led him to help the old man in the first place. The weeks following the court ruling were a whirlwind for Jason. The media attention hadn't died down completely, but it had shifted. People were now talking about what Jason would do with the fortune he had inherited, and they were watching his every move. He felt the pressure, but there was also a sense of clarity growing within him. He knew he wanted to do something meaningful, something that would make a difference, just as Mr. Clark had hoped. Jason spent long days thinking, talking with his mother, and consulting with Mr. Adams, the lawyer. The idea of using the money just for personal gain didn't sit right with him. He had never been someone who cared about wealth. What mattered to him was family, community, and doing right by the people who had been there for him. One evening, as Jason sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, a thought hit him. What if he could use Mr. Clark's money to help others in his neighborhood? What if he could give people the opportunities they needed to get ahead, just like Mr. Clark had done for him? The more he thought about it, the more the idea solidified. This wasn't just about him. This was about lifting up everyone around him. The next morning, Jason sat down with Mr. Adams and laid out his plan. "I want to use the money to create something for the community," Jason explained. "A program or center where kids like me can come and get the help they need, whether it's with school, jobs, or even just a safe place to be." Mr. Adams nodded thoughtfully. "That's a noble idea, Jason. It's also a big responsibility. But with the resources Mr. Clark left you, it's possible. You could change lives." "I'm not just thinking about kids," Jason continued. "There are so many families here who are struggling. I want to offer programs for them too. Job training, financial education, and maybe even some small business grants to help people get started." As Jason spoke, the vision became clearer in his mind. He imagined a community center right in the heart of the neighborhood, where everyone, regardless of age or background, could come and find support. It would be a place of opportunity where people could come together and help each other. It felt right. This was what Mr. Clark had entrusted him to do. Within months, Jason's dream began to take shape. The community center, named the Clark Center for Hope, opened its doors in the very building that had once been Mr. Clark's home. It was a fitting tribute, Jason thought, turning a place that had once been filled with isolation into a space of connection and growth. The opening ceremony was small but powerful. People from the neighborhood gathered to see what Jason had created, their faces filled with curiosity and hope. Jason stood at the front, feeling more nervous than he ever had in his life. His mother stood beside him, beaming with pride, and Mr. Adams gave him a reassuring nod. Jason cleared his throat, stepping up to the podium. The crowd grew quiet, waiting for him to speak. "Thank you all for being here," Jason began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "When I first met Mr. Clark, I had no idea how much my life was about to change. I didn't know that a single act of kindness could lead to something like this. But here we are." He paused, looking out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces, neighbors, classmates, people he had known his whole life. "Mr. Clark gave me something I never expected, and with it, I want to give something back. This center is for all of us. It's a place where we can come together, help each other, and build something better. I hope that, with this, we can create more opportunities for the next generation and for the families here who work so hard every day." The crowd broke into applause, and Jason felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just his victory, it was the community's. He had turned something that could have easily been a burden into a chance for growth, and he could see the hope in people's eyes as they looked at the center. As the weeks passed, the Clark Center flourished. Kids came for tutoring and after-school programs, while adults attended workshops on job training and financial literacy. The center quickly became a hub for the neighborhood, a place where people could come and feel supported. Jason became a mentor to many of the teens who came through the doors, sharing his story and encouraging them to believe in themselves. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to feel like opportunities were out of reach. Now, he had the chance to show them that they didn't have to settle, that they could dream bigger, just like he had learned to do. One afternoon, Jason stood outside the center, watching as a group of kids played basketball on the newly built court. Laughter filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, Jason felt truly at peace. He had honored Mr. Clark's memory, not just by inheriting his fortune, but by using it to create something that would outlast them both. Later that day, as Jason walked back toward his house, he passed by a small memorial plaque dedicated to Mr. Clark, placed in front of the community center. He stopped for a moment, reading the inscription, "In memory of Mr. Clark, who believed in the power of kindness and the potential of every person to make a difference." Jason smiled softly. The journey had been long, difficult, and full of unexpected challenges, but in the end, it had been worth it. He had taken something that could have torn him down and turned it into a foundation for something beautiful. As he continued walking, he knew that the path ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but with the support of his community and the lessons he'd learned along the way, he was ready for whatever came next. He was no longer just a kid from a struggling neighborhood. He was a leader, someone who had found his purpose in lifting others up. And in that, Jason had found the true inheritance Mr. Clark had left him.